There are things that I have done.
There was a time when I thought family meant everything. I worked tirelessly, sacrificing my own dreams to build a better life for my son. Every drop of sweat, every long night was for him. But when the tables turned and I needed him, I learned that sometimes the people you love the most can be the ones who hurt you the deepest. Kenneth had given his son, Lucas, every opportunity in life. He worked in grueling jobs, year after year, never complaining, just so his son could have a better future. He put Lucas through school, gave him the life he never had, and always made sure Lucas felt loved and supported. Yet when Kenneth was old and needed help, when he was vulnerable and tired, his son turned his back on him. One evening, after all those years of sacrifice, Lucas threw Kenneth out of the house. He seized the family property for himself and left his father with nothing. Kenneth was forced to sleep on the streets, without a roof over his head, a man who had given his life for someone who didn't care. But what happened next? Was Kenneth destroyed by the betrayal? No. He found something within himself that no one could take away: strength, resilience, and the will to rise again. What he did after that will change your view on what true strength really is. This is the story of a man who lost everything, yet never lost his heart. A tale of redemption, sacrifice, and the powerful lesson that sometimes the ones who hurt us the most end up showing us just how much strength we have. Kenneth had always believed in hard work, in earning every dollar with sweat and grit. Born in a small town with little to his name, he was used to struggling. His father had passed away when he was just a boy, leaving Kenneth to take on the responsibilities of the family early. His mother had struggled to make ends meet, but it was Kenneth who became her rock. He learned the value of sacrifice at an early age and the importance of putting family first. As a young man, Kenneth had big dreams, dreams that were bigger than the small town that surrounded him. But reality hit hard, as it often does. He didn't have the luxury of a college education or any kind of family wealth to fall back on. Instead, he worked odd jobs, from farming to construction, always doing what it took to make sure he could pay the bills and provide for his future family. He knew that the key to a better life was through hard work, and that's what he had done day after day. But when his son, Lucas, was born, Kenneth's world shifted. The boy became the center of his life. For Lucas, Kenneth was determined to build a foundation that would give him opportunities that Kenneth himself never had. Kenneth was determined that his son would never know the struggle he had faced growing up. Lucas had everything: good schools, a comfortable home, all the things Kenneth had worked tirelessly for. There was no greater joy in Kenneth's life than seeing Lucas thrive. Every sacrifice he made, every long hour at work, every dollar he saved, was all for his son's future. Kenneth's life was simple but fulfilling. He lived in a modest house, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. The house wasn't grand by any means, but it was home. He spent his days working construction and his evenings fixing things around the house or helping his neighbors. His hands were rough from the work, and his back always ached, but he never complained. He'd been raised to believe that hard work was a virtue and that a man should take pride in providing for his family. For years, that was the rhythm of his life. Even when Lucas grew older and began to show signs of independence, Kenneth remained steadfast. He never asked for much in return. All he wanted was for his son to be happy and successful. He didn't need extravagant gifts or praise. As long as Lucas was doing well in school, pursuing his dreams, and living a life of integrity, Kenneth was content. He had no grand ambitions for himself anymore. His only dream was to see his son live the life he had always wanted but never could achieve. The house they shared was modest but filled with memories. Family dinners, laughter, and simple moments of joy had defined their life together. Lucas had friends over, shared birthday celebrations, and even helped Kenneth with the occasional fix-it project around the house. To outsiders, their home may have seemed ordinary, but to Kenneth, it was everything. It was a reflection of his labor and love, his blood, sweat, and tears that he had poured into every corner. This was the foundation of his life, and it meant more to him than anything else in the world. However, over time, things began to change. Lucas grew older, and As he entered his late teens and early 20s, he started to pull away. At first, it was small things, missing family dinners to hang out with friends, spending less time with Kenneth. But then, it was bigger things, his growing distance, his lack of communication, his increasing sense of entitlement. Kenneth chalked it up to the usual teenage rebellion, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As Lucas entered adulthood, his attitude became more pronounced. He became increasingly frustrated with Kenneth's way of life. Kenneth's constant work, his strict adherence to routine, and his seemingly simple approach to life no longer appealed to Lucas. He began to criticize Kenneth for his lack of ambition, for his outdated values. Kenneth had always encouraged Lucas to pursue his dreams, but as Lucas grew more independent, it seemed like he no longer valued the lessons his father had taught him. One evening, after yet another argument about his future, Lucas came to Kenneth with a different kind of request. He told his father that he had no time for the old, outdated way of thinking that Kenneth had tried to instill in him. Lucas was ready to move on from the small-town life Kenneth had created. He told Kenneth he needed to find somewhere else to live, that it was time for him to go. At first, Kenneth thought it was a joke. It didn't seem real. How could his own son, his flesh and blood, the person he had worked his entire life for, ask him to leave? But as the words sank in, Kenneth realized this was no joke. Lucas meant every word. The pain Kenneth felt wasn't just from the words themselves, but from the coldness in Lucas's eyes. It was a look that Kenneth had never seen before, one that seemed to say, "You've outlived your usefulness." In that moment, Kenneth's entire world crumbled. He had spent his life building a future for Lucas, and now, in his old age, he was being cast aside like an old tool that no longer served a purpose. The next morning, Kenneth packed his things and left the house. There was no argument, no fight. He simply walked away. He couldn't bring himself to beg for his place in his own home. Instead, he carried the weight of the betrayal, the pain of rejection, and the coldness of his son's words in his heart. With nowhere to go, Kenneth found himself on the streets. The man who had worked so hard for everything now had nothing but his own pride and will to survive. But as he sat there, contemplating his next steps, something stirred within him. This was not the end. It couldn't be. In that moment, Kenneth knew that while his son had turned his back on him, he was not a man who would be defeated. He was stronger than this. He had always been strong, and no matter how far he had fallen, he would rise again. Kenneth's life had always been about doing what was right. He had worked long hours in the sun, spent sleepless nights, tried to provide for his family, and poured every ounce of energy into raising Lucas to be someone who could stand on his own. He had given his son the world, everything he could offer, from his time and energy to his love and his sacrifices. But now, standing alone in the cold, silent street after Lucas's harsh words, Kenneth realized that all of it had been in vain. The house he had spent decades building was no longer his. It wasn't just the walls and the roof. It was the memories, the milestones, the sweat and tears. All of it, everything Kenneth had worked for, had been taken from him in an instant. Lucas had crossed a line that Kenneth never thought was possible. For years, Kenneth had been the backbone of his family. He had always been the one to fix things, whether it was the roof, the car, or a broken heart. His strength, both physical and emotional, had been what kept everything together. But now, it felt like that strength had been completely depleted. What was left? A man with nothing but his pride, left to pick up the pieces of a life he had built for someone who had no appreciation for it. Lucas's betrayal was the ultimate blow. For so long, Kenneth had told himself that as long as Lucas was happy, that's all that mattered. But now, it became painfully clear that happiness, for Lucas, didn't include his father. The life Kenneth had built for his son, the values he had instilled in him, the sacrifices he had made, all of it meant nothing to Lucas now. Kenneth found himself struggling with two conflicting emotions, anger and confusion. How could Lucas, the very person he had put everything into, turn on him so callously? He replayed every moment in his mind, wondering where he had gone wrong. Had he been too hard on Lucas? Had he given him too much? Was that the problem? Or was it simply that Lucas had grown up and Kenneth had become an obstacle in his path to a bigger, more glamorous life. But the confusion didn't last long. The anger surged, and with it, a sense of injustice. How could Lucas do this to him? How could he take advantage of everything Kenneth had given him and then cast him aside as if he were nothing? Kenneth had spent his entire life providing for Lucas. He had worked double shifts to make sure Lucas could go to college, even though Kenneth himself never had the opportunity. He had sacrificed his own needs so that Lucas could have the things he never could. And this was the reward: to be discarded, abandoned, and left to fend for himself in his old age. Kenneth's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, bitter realization. He had never asked Lucas for anything in return. He had never needed much, just some appreciation, some recognition. Yet, here he was, homeless and alone, because his own son couldn't even give him the decency of a simple act of kindness. The emotional toll was far heavier than the physical one. Kenneth had always been able to overcome physical challenges. He was no stranger to hard work. But this emotional devastation was something he had never prepared for. He had assumed that no matter how difficult life became, no matter how rough the road, his family would always be there for him. But now that belief had been shattered, and Kenneth had to face a harsh truth. He was no longer part of the life he had built. He didn't know where to go next. The streets were unfamiliar, cold, and unforgiving. He could go to a shelter, but that wasn't an option he felt comfortable with. There was too much pride left in him. He couldn't allow himself to depend on anyone, not even the system. Days passed as Kenneth wandered from place to place, his mind consumed with thoughts of Lucas and the life he had lost. He tried not to dwell on it, but it was impossible. He had given everything to his son, and now it felt like everything had been taken from him. He remembered when Lucas had been a child, when he used to look at his father with admiration, when he would ask questions and listen to every word Kenneth said. That Lucas, the one full of hope, curiosity, and respect, was gone. In his place was a man who no longer cared, a man who believed that his father was nothing more than an inconvenience. But Kenneth's pride wouldn't allow him to wallow in self-pity for long. He couldn't afford to. He had to move forward to find a way to survive. He remembered what his father had taught him: never give up, no matter the circumstances. And that's what Kenneth decided to do. He wouldn't let Lucas's betrayal define him. He would pick himself up and prove that he could still stand on his own 2 feet. The first step was finding work. Kenneth knew he wasn't too old to do what he had always done: construction. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it was a job he could rely on. It wasn't long before he found a construction crew looking for extra hands. The work was grueling, the hours long, but it gave Kenneth something he hadn't had in days: purpose. Even as he worked, though, he couldn't stop thinking about Lucas. The betrayal stung in ways he hadn't imagined. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but every hammer strike reminded him of the empty house he once called home. He had nothing left. No family, no home, no future. Or so he thought. It wasn't until one night, when he returned to his small, dingy apartment after a long day of work, that the phone call came. It was from Lucas. At first, Kenneth couldn't bring himself to answer. He had spent days avoiding the thought of his son, of what had happened. But something inside him told him to pick up the phone. "Dad, I need to talk to you," Lucas said, his voice shaky, full of something Kenneth had never heard before: regret. For a moment, Kenneth didn't know how to respond. He was filled with a mix of emotions: anger, confusion, but also something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But hope came with a price. He would listen to his son, but only if Lucas was willing to show him that he had truly changed. The road to redemption wasn't easy, and Kenneth knew that it wouldn't be given freely. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where Kenneth would have to decide whether he was willing to give his son a chance, or if the betrayal had cut too deep to repair. But one thing was certain: this wasn't the end of Kenneth's story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. The phone call from Lucas was a stark reminder of the painful fracture in their relationship. For a moment, Kenneth stared at the phone, his mind racing. What could his son possibly want after everything that had happened? After the betrayal, the cruelty, the abandonment? Kenneth had spent so many sleepless nights replaying the moment Lucas kicked him out of the house. His voice cold, his words sharper than any knife. The anger Kenneth had felt then was still fresh, a wound that had yet to heal. The truth was, Kenneth had never expected Lucas to turn on him. He had spent decades building a life around the idea that family meant unconditional support. He had always been there for Lucas through every hardship, every struggle, every triumph. And in return, Kenneth had expected nothing more than respect and love. He thought that was the bare minimum, the unspoken bond that tied them together. But now, that bond had been shattered. Kenneth didn't answer the call right away. He wanted to, but part of him felt that doing so would be like opening a wound that had only just begun to scab over. It would be like inviting more pain back in his life. But another part of him, the part that had raised Lucas, the part that had believed in family no matter what, couldn't just walk away from his son. Kenneth had never been one to abandon those he loved, no matter how much they hurt him. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Kenneth picked up the phone. His heart pounded in his chest, the familiar weight of pain settling in his stomach. "Dad, I need to talk to you." Lucas's voice came through, sounding small, uncertain, and broken. It was a far cry from the confident, dismissive tone he had used when he had kicked Kenneth out. For a moment, Kenneth almost didn't recognize his son. "What is it, Lucas?" Kenneth replied, his voice steady, but the bitterness crept in as it always did when he spoke of this. "After everything that's happened, what could you possibly want from me?" Lucas hesitated. Kenneth could hear the shakiness in his voice as he responded, "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. I've been thinking about it, and I don't know what to do anymore. I need you, Dad. Please. I'm sorry." The words were so simple, but they felt like a bomb had dropped. Kenneth's anger surged, but this time it was mixed with something else, something unexpected. Was it regret? Was it vulnerability? Or was it just a son trying to find the courage to admit he was wrong? Kenneth closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. His chest tightened as memories of the past flooded in. He remembered all the times he had given his all to Lucas, when he had taken on multiple jobs to make sure Lucas could have the things he never had. The long nights spent fixing things around the house, only to be met with indifference or, worse, disdain from Lucas. Kenneth had given his best for years, and this was the result. His son was now asking for forgiveness, as if it were so simple. "You've made your bed, Lucas," Kenneth said coldly, his voice laced with a sadness he couldn't hide. "And now you want me to clean it up for you? After everything you've done to me? You left me homeless. You took everything I worked for, and now you expect me to just forget it all? To forgive you just like that?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Kenneth could feel the weight of the moment. Every word he spoke felt like it mattered more than anything he had said in years. It wasn't just anger now, it was disappointment, deep and searing. "I can't undo what I've done," Lucas finally said, his voice cracking. "I know I can't, but I'm trying to fix it. I want to fix what I broke. I need you to give me a chance, Dad. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for one." Kenneth felt his resolve begin to waver. Was this real? Was his son truly apologizing? Or was this another ploy to get something from him? The betrayal had been so deep that Kenneth couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas's actions had been a sign of something darker, something about his character that Kenneth could never have imagined. Was this apology genuine, or was it just the desperate plea of a man who had nowhere else to turn? For a moment, Kenneth thought about hanging up the phone and walking away from it all. Maybe he was better off without Lucas in his life. Maybe the years of sacrifice had been in vain, and maybe it was time to let go. But as he sat there in the stillness of his apartment, he realized that he wasn't ready to close that door. There was something inside him, some flicker of hope, that made him want to believe in the possibility of redemption. "Why should I believe you?" Kenneth finally asked, his voice low. "You left me. You threw me out like I was nothing. And now you want me to take you back into my life? Just like that. I know I've hurt you. But I swear, Dad, I'm not the person I was. I've messed up in so many ways, and I can't change the past. But I'm trying to be better. Please don't give up on me," Lucas said, his voice raw with emotion. Kenneth remained silent. He wanted to scream, to let all the pain out, to tell Lucas how he felt, how betrayed and hurt he was. But something in his son's voice made him hesitate. It was a cry for help, a plea for forgiveness. Lucas was no longer the arrogant young man who had tossed him aside. This was a person who had been humbled by the consequences of his actions. Kenneth stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. His breath came in shallow gasps. He had been through so much. He couldn't afford to let his guard down again. But the possibility of redemption for both himself and Lucas lingered in the air. He wasn't sure if he could forgive his son yet, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to rebuild what had been lost. "I'll think about it," Kenneth said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "But don't think for a second that it's going to be easy. Trust is earned, not given." With that, he hung up the phone, his heart heavy but strangely lighter at the same time. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that the road to healing would be long, difficult, and filled with uncertainty. The question now was whether Lucas could prove that he had truly changed, and whether Kenneth could find it within himself to forgive. The pain was suffocating, and for the first time in his life, Kenneth found himself questioning everything he had ever believed. Had he been wrong to devote so much of himself to Lucas? Had he given too much, sacrificed too much, and in the end, left nothing for himself? And more importantly, was this what family was supposed to be? Was this how things were supposed to end? Betrayed and alone, left to pick up the pieces of a broken relationship? He sank into his chair, his thoughts spiraling. What hurt the most was that he couldn't even recognize his son anymore. The Lucas he had known, his bright-eyed, ambitious child who once looked up to him with admiration and love, was gone. In his place was a stranger, someone whose actions betrayed every value Kenneth had tried to instill. It felt like a cruel joke, the son he had raised now showing him the harshest form of indifference. Kenneth could still remember the early days of Lucas's life as if they were yesterday. When Lucas was little, he had been his pride and joy. Kenneth had loved watching him grow, teaching him how to ride a bike, helping him with his schoolwork, showing him how to be strong and independent. Those moments had been sacred to Kenneth. He had poured everything he had into making sure Lucas had a life better than his own. And for a long time, it had seemed to work. But somewhere along the way, Lucas had changed. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing Kenneth as his father, his protector, and started seeing him as just another obstacle in his path. The realization stung more than anything. Was he really just another thing to be discarded? A man whose love was no longer valued? His chest tightened at the thought. It wasn't just the house that Lucas had taken. It was his dignity, his trust, his very identity as a father. Kenneth thought back to his own father, who had never been around much. He had raised Kenneth in a harsh world, one where survival was the only priority. But even with that, Kenneth had never felt abandoned. His father had always been there in his own way. And now, here he was, struggling with the idea of letting go of his own son, his flesh and blood. Kenneth stood up abruptly, shaking off the heavy weight of his thoughts. He needed to do something, anything to take control of the situation. He couldn't just sit in this limbo forever, torn between anger and love. But at the same time, he couldn't let himself fall back into the same patterns, putting his son's needs above his own, forgiving him without any real change. There had to be a balance. There had to be a way to heal, to move forward, without losing himself in the process. The thought of Lucas's apology, of his tearful voice asking for forgiveness, haunted Kenneth. Was it genuine? Was it the desperate plea of a son who truly regretted his actions? Or was it just the fear of facing the consequences of his own failures? Kenneth didn't know. But what he did know was that if there was any chance for reconciliation, Lucas would have to show him, through his actions, not just his words, that he was ready to change. Kenneth took a deep breath, steadied himself, and walked to the door. He had made up his mind. He wouldn't rush into forgiveness, but he wouldn't shut Lucas out completely, either. There was a chance, just a chance, that they could rebuild what had been broken. But it would take time, and it would take trust. And above all, it would take a willingness from both sides to confront the truth of what had happened, to acknowledge the pain, and to decide whether they could move forward together. The road ahead was uncertain, but Kenneth knew one thing for sure. He would no longer be the man who sacrificed everything for someone who didn't care. He would be the man who chose his own path, who fought for his own dignity. And if Lucas wanted to be a part of that, he would have to prove that he was ready to fight, too. The days that followed were filled with a sense of quiet turmoil. Kenneth continued with his work, long hours at the construction site, his body growing more weary each day. Yet his mind never stopped spinning. Every time he laid down to rest, every time the silence of the night crept in, the question lingered. What do I do now? He couldn't escape it. It was always there, waiting at the edge of his thoughts. The phone call with Lucas had given him a glimpse into something he wasn't ready to face. There was a small voice inside him, a voice that reminded him of the years of love, of sacrifice, of all the good times they had shared as father and son. That voice urged him to consider the possibility of healing, of reconciling. But it was drowned out by the anger, the sense of betrayal that had built up like a wall between him and the world. Every time he thought of his son, that wall grew taller, thicker. Kenneth had always prided himself on his ability to stand firm, to face whatever came his way with the unyielding strength of someone who had learned to survive. But now, it felt as if that strength had turned into something that kept him locked in place, unwilling to move forward or backward. The choice between forgiveness and letting go was paralyzing. Then, one evening, everything changed. Kenneth was walking home from a job site when he saw a familiar figure standing on the corner of the street. His heart stopped. It was Lucas. He stood there, almost like a shadow, hesitating in the streetlight. He looked thinner than the last time Kenneth had seen him, his face drawn and tired. His eyes, those eyes that had once been full of youthful ambition and confidence, were now weary, filled with regret and something Kenneth had never expected to see: vulnerability. "I've messed up," Lucas continued, his voice breaking. "I know what I did. I didn't just hurt you. I destroyed everything we had. I was so selfish. I was so blind. And now, I don't know how to fix it." Kenneth's chest tightened, his thoughts swirling. He had never expected to hear his son say these words. The Lucas he had known, the one who had tossed him aside without a second thought, was gone. This Lucas, standing before him, was someone who had been humbled by his own mistakes. He was raw, stripped down to the core, and for the first time, Kenneth saw the son he had raised. This wasn't a man who was trying to manipulate him. This was a man who had lost everything and was now trying to rebuild himself, piece by piece. "I know you don't owe me anything," Lucas said, his eyes pleading, "but I'm asking for a chance to make things right. I can't change what I did, but I want to show you that I'm not the same person I was. Please, Dad, I need you." The words hit Kenneth like a wave. A part of him wanted to hold on to the anger, the hurt that had festered in his heart for so long. It felt safer to stay angry, to refuse to forgive. But as he looked at Lucas, standing there, vulnerable and broken, something within him shifted. Kenneth's hand trembled as he ran it through his hair, the years of exhaustion weighing on him. He was torn. The conflict between the man who had raised Lucas and the man who had been abandoned by him seemed like a chasm too wide to cross. But in that moment, standing there face to face with his son, Kenneth realized something. Forgiveness wasn't just about Lucas. It wasn't about excusing his actions or pretending the past hadn't happened. Forgiveness was about Kenneth finding peace. It was about Kenneth reclaiming his heart from the bitterness that had been poisoning it. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Kenneth said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not yet. You hurt me. You took everything from me, and you didn't even care. But I can't keep holding on to that anger. It's eating me up. So, I'll say this, I'm willing to try. But you need to show me that you mean it. You need to prove that you're really ready to change." For a moment, the air hung thick with uncertainty. Lucas stared at Kenneth, his eyes filled with something Kenneth hadn't seen in years. Hope. Real, genuine hope. It was a silent promise that perhaps this wasn't the end. Perhaps it was the beginning of something new, something that could be rebuilt from the ruins of their broken relationship. Lucas nodded, his eyes never leaving Kenneth's. "I will. I'll prove it to you. I swear." Kenneth didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that there might be a way forward. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, and there would be moments when the pain of the past threatened to resurface. But for the first time, Kenneth felt like there was hope, not just for Lucas, but for himself as well. As he stood there, watching his son with a mixture of guarded optimism and cautious acceptance, Kenneth realized that the greatest lesson he had learned over the past few weeks was this. Forgiveness wasn't just for the person who had wronged you. It was for yourself. It was the only way to move forward, to release the grip of the past, and to embrace the possibility of healing. Kenneth woke up the next morning with a feeling he hadn't had in a long time: uncertainty. The weight of the night before, of his decision to give Lucas a chance, lingered heavily in his chest. He had agreed to give his son a shot at redemption, but the question gnawed at him. Was it the right choice? Could he really open himself up to Lucas again, after everything that had happened? The phone call had been the first step, but that was only words. Now it was about action. Kenneth knew that the road to redemption wouldn't be easy for Lucas, and it wouldn't be easy for him either. Years of resentment, anger, and heartbreak couldn't just be wiped away with a few heartfelt words. The truth was, Kenneth wasn't sure if he could ever fully trust Lucas again, but he had made a decision. He had chosen to open the door, even if just a crack, and see if Lucas would be able to push it open with his own actions. Lucas had promised to prove that he was ready to change, but words had failed before. Actions, Kenneth knew, were the only thing that could build the bridge between them now. He had to see the truth in Lucas's commitment before he could ever allow the relationship to return to anything resembling what it had been. Kenneth's phone buzzed just as he was about to leave for work. It was a text from Lucas. He opened it cautiously, almost bracing himself for the disappointment he had felt so many times before. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what I've done. I know it's not enough, but I want to show you that I'm serious about changing. I'm coming over this evening. Please just hear me out." Kenneth stared at the message, his fingers lingering on the screen. What now? He could easily ignore the message. He could stay angry, keep the distance between them as a shield to protect himself from more pain. But he had made a promise to himself the night before that he would try. And try meant facing the possibility of more hurt. It meant confronting the anger, the hurt, and even the fear of being hurt again. As the hours passed, Kenneth's mind raced. By the time the evening arrived, he had gone over every possible outcome, every scenario. He knew that Lucas's presence in his life was never going to be the same as it once was. Things would never return to the way they were when Lucas was a child, when the bond between father and son had been strong and unquestioned. But maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something new, something more honest, more grounded in reality. When Lucas arrived that evening, it wasn't with the arrogance Kenneth had come to expect from him in the past. Instead, Lucas stood at the door, his hands nervously tucked into his pockets, his posture hunched slightly, like a man about to face judgment. Kenneth studied him carefully. The young man standing in front of him was no longer the one who had thrown him out, who had turned his back without a second thought. This was someone different, someone who had been humbled by the consequences of his actions. "Hey, Dad," Lucas said quietly, his voice unsure. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me again, but I need to try. I need to do something to show you that I'm not the same person anymore." Kenneth didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, looking at his son. The sight of him, the vulnerability in his eyes, the weight of his words, stirred something deep inside Kenneth. It wasn't just a father's desire to protect his child anymore. It was the reality of what had happened, of what they had both lost, that felt almost unbearable. Finally, Kenneth stepped back, wordlessly motioning for Lucas to come in. There was still a part of him that didn't want to forgive, that still felt the sting of betrayal. But there was also the part of him that wanted desperately to believe that change was possible, that people could grow, could learn from their mistakes, could become better. They sat in silence for a moment, the years of pain still hanging between them, thick and unresolved. Finally, Lucas spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost pleading. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I can't take back what I did. I can't undo the pain I caused you, but I could try to show you that I'm not that selfish, spoiled kid anymore. I've made some big mistakes, and I'm paying for them. I've messed up so many things in my life, but I can't live with the thought that I've lost you for good." Kenneth looked at him, searching his son's face for any sign of the old Lucas, the one who had lied, manipulated, and abandoned him. But what he saw instead was the genuine remorse that was reflected in his eyes. Lucas wasn't asking for Kenneth to forget. He wasn't asking for an easy way out. He was simply asking for a chance to make amends. The words that Kenneth had been holding back for days finally came to the surface. "Lucas, I don't know if I can ever forgive you completely. What you did, it hurt more than I ever imagined possible. You tore apart everything we had. But I'm willing to give you the chance to prove that you've changed. Not with words, but with actions. I don't know where we go from here, but I'm willing to try. For both of us." Lucas's face softened, his eyes filling with something that Kenneth had hoped for, but didn't expect to see. Hope. It was a fragile, tender thing, but it was real. And it was enough for Kenneth to believe that there could be something, even a small something, to rebuild. "I won't let you down, Dad. I promise," Lucas said, his voice steady now firm. Kenneth nodded slowly, the heavy weight in his chest lifting just a little. It wasn't the resolution of everything. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would be okay. But it was a beginning, a small, fragile start to a new chapter. As the evenings stretched on, they talked. For the first time in years, they talked openly, honestly, without the walls of anger and resentment that had defined their last months together. Kenneth listened as Lucas spoke about the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned. And for the first time in a long time, Kenneth felt like he was hearing his son, not the person who had betrayed him, but the person who wanted to change. The night ended with a quiet understanding between them. Kenneth still didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. And though it was uncertain, the possibility of healing was there. The hours passed slowly as Kenneth and Lucas sat together, the rawness of the moment lingering between them. It was strange, this new dynamic between them. It felt like they were both walking on fragile ground, each hesitant, unsure of what the next step would be. There was no pretending that everything was fine now, no magical healing that would make everything right. The pain, the betrayal, the scars left behind by Lucas's actions couldn't just be erased. But for the first time in a long while, Kenneth allowed himself to believe that perhaps they could start to heal. "I'm not expecting you to just forgive me," Lucas continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I know that's not how this works. But I need you to know that I'm not the same person I was. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that to you, to show you that I'm serious about changing. I want to be someone you can be proud of, Dad." Kenneth took a slow, deep breath, his chest tightening. He had no idea where this would lead, but in his heart, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years, something that might have once been called trust. But trust was a fragile thing, and Kenneth wasn't sure if he was ready to offer it yet. He wanted to believe that Lucas had changed, that the man in front of him was different from the one who had thrown him out. But years of disappointment, betrayal, and heartache couldn't simply be undone with a few words. Still, there was something about Lucas's sincerity that made Kenneth hesitate. There was no arrogance in his eyes anymore. There was no entitlement, no expectation that Kenneth should just accept him back with open arms. This was different. This wasn't a son trying to manipulate or get something from his father. This was a son who was humbled by the harsh reality of his actions, a son who had finally seen the consequences of his behavior. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," Kenneth said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just because of what you did, but because of what you didn't do. You left me when I needed you the most. You turned your back on me, and I'm still carrying the weight of that. But I see that you're trying, and maybe that's a start." Lucas nodded, his eyes welling with tears, but he didn't say anything. He knew that Kenneth wasn't offering unconditional forgiveness yet. He knew that this was just the beginning, that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But for the first time, he believed there was a way forward. There was hope. Kenneth stood up, walking to the window, looking out at the city below. The world outside seemed unchanged, people moving, living their lives, unaware of the quiet battle taking place within the walls of this small apartment. Kenneth knew that the path he had chosen wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be smooth, but it was a path, and that was something. I don't know what happens next, Kenneth said, his back to Lucas. I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again, and maybe I'll never be able to forget what you did. But I'm willing to try. I'll give you the chance to show me that you've changed, but it won't be on your terms. It'll be on mine. And if you're serious about fixing this, about making it right, then you need to prove it. Every day, Lucas's voice was thick with emotion when he spoke again. I will, Dad. I swear I will. Kenneth turned back to face him, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was the first step in something new. I'm not going to make this easy for you, Lucas, Kenneth said, his voice steady. But I'm giving you a chance. Make the most of it. Lucas didn't speak for a long moment, his eyes searching Kenneth's face as if trying to find something, anything, that would give him the reassurance he desperately needed. Finally, he nodded, his eyes determined. I won't let you down, Dad. I promise. Kenneth could see the sincerity in his eyes, but part of him still held back. It was hard to completely believe in Lucas again, to trust that this was real and not just another fleeting moment of remorse. But for the first time, Kenneth felt a small sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new one that might be filled with pain, but also with the possibility of redemption and healing. The weeks that followed were far from easy. Kenneth didn't expect them to be. Every day felt like a step toward something new, but each one was also a reminder of the years that had been lost. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. Lucas had shown him that he was willing to change, that he truly wanted to make amends, but Kenneth was still guarded. The sting of betrayal, of being abandoned when he was most vulnerable, wasn't something that could be washed away with a few heartfelt words. But it was something. It was a start. Kenneth had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, and over time, Lucas's actions began to speak volumes. He showed up at Kenneth's apartment every week, not with excuses or promises, but with a genuine desire to rebuild the relationship between them. He took responsibility for the pain he had caused, and more importantly, he put in the work to change. He apologized not just once, but repeatedly. Each time, it was a reminder that Lucas wasn't trying to erase the past, but instead trying to move forward with accountability. At first, Kenneth was hesitant. He didn't let his guard down completely. There were still moments when the pain from the past resurfaced, when memories of the way Lucas had turned on him came flooding back. But as time passed, Kenneth began to see glimpses of the son he had raised, the one full of potential, the one who had once made him proud. Lucas had started working 2 jobs, paying off his debts, and attending therapy. For the first time in years, Kenneth saw him putting in the effort, not for any reward, but because he knew it was the right thing to do. There were still setbacks, moments when the old Lucas seemed to peek through, moments when his arrogance flared up, or when he'd make decisions that seemed to push him back into the same patterns. But with each setback, Kenneth saw a change, however small, in Lucas's willingness to correct himself. He wasn't running away from his mistakes anymore. Instead, he was facing them head-on. It wasn't easy for Kenneth either. The process of forgiving, truly forgiving, was harder than he had imagined. There were days when the anger flared up again, when the hurt seemed to drown out the progress. Kenneth had to confront his own fears, his fear of being hurt again, his fear of giving too much and not getting anything in return. But with each step Lucas took to prove his commitment, Kenneth started to soften. He allowed himself to be vulnerable again, to accept that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the past, but about letting go of the hold it had on his heart. One evening, several months after the difficult conversation in Kenneth's apartment, Lucas came to him with something different in his hands. It wasn't another apology or another request for forgiveness. This time, it was a simple, handwritten letter. He handed it to Kenneth silently, his expression earnest. Kenneth took the letter and opened it slowly. Inside, Lucas had written, "Dad, I know that everything I've done can't be undone, and I can't ask you to forget what I've done. I just want you to know that I'm so deeply sorry. You've given me everything, and I've taken it all for granted. But I will never stop trying to be the man you hoped I would be. This isn't just about fixing what I've broken between us, but about showing you that I'm capable of being better. I want to earn your trust back, step by step, and I'm committed to doing the hard work it takes to get there." The words stung Kenneth in the most unexpected way. Not because they were anything new. He had heard similar apologies before, but because they were finally the words of a son who was taking ownership of his actions, not out of guilt, but out of a true desire to change. Kenneth folded the letter carefully and set it down on the table between them. He looked at Lucas for a long moment, considering everything: the years of struggle, the hurt, the pain, the healing. The silence between them felt different now. It wasn't full of accusations or of anger. It was full of something else. Something Kenneth hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He reached out and placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "I can't say that everything's forgiven," Kenneth said quietly. "And I can't pretend that things will ever be the same as they were before. But I'm willing to try. We're not where we want to be, but we're a lot further along than we were." Lucas looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude, mixed with the understanding that it wasn't the end of the journey, but another step forward. "I'll keep trying, Dad. I promise. I'll keep proving it." Kenneth nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's all I can ask for, son. One step at a time." And in that moment, the weight Kenneth had been carrying, years of disappointment, anger, and betrayal, lifted just a little. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it was manageable now. They weren't starting over. They were building something new from the ground up. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, Kenneth knew that the bond between them had changed. It was stronger now, not because of the absence of pain, but because of the willingness to confront that pain together, to move forward despite it. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you loved? How did you cope with the hurt and the anger that followed? Do you believe that forgiveness is possible after something so deep, or is it a bridge too far? I want to hear your thoughts. Share your own experiences of betrayal, forgiveness, or redemption in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about the difficult choices we face when it comes to healing relationships, whether it's with a family member, a friend, or anyone who has hurt us. Your story could be the one that helps someone else take that first step toward reconciliation or healing. If you're struggling with a similar situation, remember, it's okay to take your time. Healing isn't about rushing the process. It's about finding the strength to move forward, even when it feels impossible. And if you're the one seeking forgiveness, remember that actions speak louder than words. It's not about erasing the past. It's about proving through consistent effort and genuine change that you are committed to making things right. Don't forget to like this video if you found something here that resonated with you, and share it with anyone you think might benefit from hearing this story. You never know who might be struggling with the same questions or challenges. Lastly, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any future videos on forgiveness, relationships, and life's toughest decisions. We'll continue to dive into these topics, providing stories, advice, and insights that will help guide you through the most difficult moments of life. Remember, no matter where you are on your journey, you're not alone. Keep moving forward, step by step.